Have you ever wondered what really goes on in a big company when the boss isn't around? Well, this is a story about a CEO who decided to find out for himself, and what he discovered changed everything. Picture this. A successful black CEO stands in his fancy office, looking down at the city from the top floor of his company's building. He built this tech company from nothing, and now it's worth millions. But something's bothering him. More and more people are quitting their jobs, 40% more than last year. At first, he thought this was normal. After all, people often switch jobs in the tech world, right? But then he started noticing little things that didn't feel right. When he walked into rooms, people would suddenly stop talking. During company meetings, some employees wouldn't make eye contact, and the break room would get really quiet whenever he showed up for coffee. One morning, everything changed. He was walking up the stairs, something he rarely did, when he overheard two employees talking. They didn't know he was there. "This place shows one face to the world and another to its workers," one person said. "The YouTube videos and ads make it look so perfect, but working here is totally different." Those words hit him like a ton of bricks. He'd always thought his company was different. They'd won awards for being a great place to work. They had all these programs to help employees from different backgrounds. So why were people so unhappy? That's when he got an idea. A crazy idea, but maybe crazy was exactly what he needed. He decided to go undercover in his own company. Not as the boss everyone knew, but as a regular temp worker at the front desk. He called the one person he knew would give it to him straight, his older sister. She worked in business consulting and never sugarcoated anything. "I need to see what's really going on," he told her. "Not the polished version people show me because I'm the CEO." "You want to be a fake receptionist?" she asked, not sounding shocked at all. She knew how he thought. "Exactly. I'll move around different departments. See how things work when nobody's trying to impress the big boss." His sister was quiet for a moment. "You know this could blow up in your face, right? What if someone figures out who you are?" Looking in the window's reflection, he smiled. "That's why I need your help. I need to become a completely different person. New look, new background story, everything." "The board members won't like this," she warned. "They don't need to know," he replied. "I'll tell them I'm checking out new office locations overseas. Only you and my HR head will know what's really happening." As he talked about his plan, he felt nervous but excited. He'd need to change everything. His clothes, the way he talked, even how he walked. No more expensive suits. No more giving orders. He'd need to learn how to be just another worker trying to pay their bills. But the biggest change would be learning to just listen. Not as someone in charge who needs to fix problems right away, but as a coworker who's going through the same daily struggles as everyone else. He looked at his schedule and found a perfect 3-week gap before the next big meeting. That would give him enough time to really understand what was happening in his company. Were all those fancy programs actually helping people? Or were they just nice-sounding words on paper? As he sat at his desk writing out his plan, he felt more alive than he had in months. Something wasn't working in his company, and he was going to fix it. But first, he needed to find out exactly what was wrong. What he didn't know then was that these next 3 weeks wouldn't just change his company. They would completely change how he saw everything about leadership and what it really means to be in charge. The transformation from CEO to receptionist wasn't as easy as just changing clothes. It took a whole team of people working behind the scenes to make it happen. The HR director brought in a makeup artist who usually worked in movies, someone who knew how to keep a secret. "We need to make sure no one recognizes him," the makeup artist said, studying the CEO's face. "But we also need to make sure the makeup can last through a full workday without touching up. You won't be able to spend 30 minutes in the bathroom fixing your look." They spent hours trying different looks. The makeup artist added slight wrinkles around his eyes, changed the shape of his eyebrows, and even made his cheekbones look different. The CEO barely recognized himself in the mirror. But looks were just the beginning. The HR director brought in someone to help him act like a regular temp worker. "You can't walk like a CEO," the acting coach told him. "You have that confident stride that screams, 'I'm in charge.' We need to change that." They practiced everything: how to sit at a desk without looking too straight, how to look slightly unsure when asking questions, even how to eat lunch like someone who's counting their dollars. "Remember," the coach said, "you're supposed to be someone who needs this job, not someone who owns the company." The CEO's sister helped create his fake background story. They decided he'd be a former small business owner whose shop closed during the pandemic. It was a story many people could relate to, and it explained why a middle-aged man would be starting over as a temp worker. "Your name is Robert," his sister said. "You go by Rob. You're married, 2 kids in college, and you're doing temp work while looking for something permanent. Keep it simple. Keep it real." They picked out his new clothes from regular stores. Nothing fancy. No designer labels, no expensive shoes. Just normal business casual wear that looked slightly worn. His sister made him wear everything around her house for a few days to make the clothes look naturally lived in. The hardest part was learning to use the reception desk computer system like a beginner. The CEO knew every program inside and out, but Rob wouldn't. They set up a practice desk where he had to fumble with the phone system and asked basic questions about the software. "You need to make mistakes," the HR director advised. "Not big ones, but little ones that any new person would make. If you're too perfect, people will get suspicious." They also had to plan his schedule carefully. He would start at the main reception desk, then move to different departments as a floating temp. This way, he could see how things worked throughout the whole company without staying in one place too long. The night before his first day, the CEO stood in front of his bathroom mirror at home, practicing his new identity. "Hi, I'm Rob, the new temp," he said again and again, trying to make it sound natural. Each time, he tried to forget that he owned the building he'd be walking into tomorrow. His sister called to give him one last pep talk. "Remember, you're not there to fix things," she said. "You're there to learn. Just watch and listen. And whatever happens, don't react like a CEO." That night, he hardly slept. He kept thinking about all the things that could go wrong. What if someone recognized him? What if he slipped up and showed that he knew too much? What if this whole crazy plan was a huge mistake? But then he remembered those 2 employees he'd overheard in the stairwell, and how unhappy they'd sounded. He thought about all the people who'd quit over the past year. Something was wrong in his company, and tomorrow he'd start finding out what it was. As he laid out his new clothes for the next day, cheap dress shirt, worn khakis, scuffed shoes, he felt like an actor preparing for the biggest role of his life. In a way he was, and the show was about to begin. The first week as a receptionist opened the CEO's eyes in ways he never expected. Sitting at the front desk was like watching a completely different company from the one he thought he knew. His first morning started at 7:30 a.m., an hour earlier than he usually arrived as CEO. Right away, he noticed something strange. The cleaning staff was still working when he got there, but they seemed nervous and rushed. They kept looking over their shoulders, especially when security guards walked by. At first, he thought he was imagining things, but then he saw why. A cleaning lady who'd worked in the building for 12 years was trying to take her morning break. She had her small lunch bag with her as she headed to the employee break room, the same break room the CEO had made sure was open to all staff. But before she could get there, a security guard stopped her. "You know you're not supposed to use this break room," the guard said loudly, making several people turn and stare. "Your break room is downstairs in the basement." The CEO, now disguised as Rob the temp, watched as the cleaning lady quietly turned around and walked away. His heart sank. There was no policy about separate break rooms. He'd specifically made sure of that when he wrote the company guidelines. Later that morning, While learning the reception desk system from another temp worker, he heard more stories. "Yeah, that happens all the time," the temp told him. "The cleaning staff, maintenance people, anyone who's not in an office job, they get treated differently. Nobody says it out loud, but everyone knows." During lunch, he took his brown bag sandwich to the basement to see this other break room. What he found made him sick to his stomach. It was a small room with broken chairs, a microwave that looked 20 years old, and flickering fluorescent lights. This wasn't what he'd wanted for his company at all. But the break room was just the beginning. From his spot at the reception desk, he saw how different groups of employees were treated. The security team was quick to check IDs of some people, but waved others through without a second glance. He noticed patterns in who got stopped and who didn't. He also saw how some employees would change their behavior completely depending on who was around. The same manager who was all smiles with senior staff would turn cold and dismissive with maintenance workers or cleaning staff. By Wednesday, he started keeping notes on his phone, pretending to play games during quiet moments at the desk. He wrote down everything he saw: how long certain employees had to wait to get help with their badges, who got greeted by name, who got ignored. The most eye-opening moment came during a fire drill. As everyone filed out of the building, he watched how people grouped together. It wasn't just about job titles. There were invisible lines being drawn that had nothing to do with what people did for work and everything to do with how they looked or where they came from. On Friday afternoon, a young woman from the tech team came to the front desk almost in tears. She needed to sign for a package, but her badge wasn't working. The security guard made her wait for 45 minutes while helping others who came later. The CEO, still in his role as Rob, finally asked another guard to help her, pretending he didn't know the procedure. "Some people just like to complain," the first guard said after she left. "They think everything should be handed to them." That weekend, sitting in his home office and looking at his notes, the CEO felt a mix of anger and shame. How had he not seen any of this before? The company's diversity awards and inclusion policies were hanging on the walls. But down in the everyday reality of his building, people were living in two completely different worlds. And this was just his first week. As he prepared for week 2, where he'd be moving to the sales floor reception desk, he wondered what else he was going to discover about the company he thought he knew so well. Week 2 started on the sales floor, and it was like entering a whole different world. Up here, everyone wore sharp suits and carried expensive laptops. As the new temp receptionist, the CEO got a front row seat to how things really worked among the middle managers and their teams. His first eye-opening moment came during a Monday morning meeting. Through the glass walls of the conference room, he watched a young analyst presenting what looked like a new marketing plan. Even from his desk, he could see how excited she was, pointing to charts and explaining her ideas to her team leader. Later that day, while sorting mail, he overheard 2 employees talking about that same presentation. "She spent 3 months working on that plan," one whispered. "And you know her boss is going to take all the credit when he shows it to the executives next week." Sure enough, 3 days later, that same team leader walked past the reception desk, practicing a presentation under his breath. The CEO recognized the words. They were exactly what the young analyst had presented earlier, but now her name was nowhere to be found on the slides. The pattern kept showing up everywhere he looked. A junior employee would come up with a brilliant idea, share it with their manager, and then watch as that manager presented it as their own work. It was like a game everyone knew about, but nobody talked about openly. One afternoon, while fixing the copy machine, something he'd never done as CEO, he listened to 2 team members talking about a successful project. "We did all the work," one said, "stayed late every night for 2 weeks. But in the company newsletter, it only mentioned our supervisor's name." The CEO noticed something else too. It seemed like certain employees had to work twice as hard to get half the recognition. He watched a team member pitch 5 different ideas before getting one approved, while another person's first suggestion was immediately celebrated. During lunch breaks, he'd sit in the corner of the break room, eating his packed lunch and listening. People talked more freely around a temp worker. He heard stories about missed promotions, about ideas being stolen, about certain employees always getting the best projects while others got stuck with basic tasks. One conversation really stuck with him. Two workers were talking about the company's mentorship program, something he'd been really proud of starting. "It looks great on paper," one said, "but have you noticed? Some of us get mentors who are actually helpful, while others get stuck with people who never even meet with them." The most shocking moment came when he saw how different managers treated the same situation. A project was running late, and two different team members had to explain why to their supervisors. The first supervisor listened patiently and offered help. The second one immediately started talking about performance reviews and meeting expectations. By Thursday, he'd started noticing the small groups that formed after meetings. Some employees would be invited to quick chats that turned into important strategy sessions. Others, despite having more experience or better ideas, were left out completely. He watched a talented employee try 3 times to sign up for a leadership training program. Each time, her manager found some reason why now wasn't a good time. Meanwhile, another employee with less experience was immediately approved. The CEO spent his evenings writing everything down in a notebook he kept at home. Pages filled up with examples of good ideas being stolen, credit being misdirected, and opportunities being handed out based on who people knew rather than what they could do. What hit him hardest was realizing how blind he'd been to all of this. From his office on the top floor, everything had looked perfect. The reports he got always showed positive numbers. The managers he met always had good explanations for everything. But down here, in the middle of it all, he could see how the system really worked, or didn't work. As he prepared for his third and final week, moving to another department, he wondered how many careers had been quietly damaged by what he was seeing. How many good ideas had been lost. How many talented people had given up and left. The answers to these questions were starting to keep him up at night. By the start of his third week, the CEO began seeing patterns everywhere. It wasn't just about individual managers anymore. There was something bigger going on. Moving between departments as a temp receptionist let him see how deep the problems really went. He noticed it first in the little things, like how people acted differently in the elevator depending on who got in. When executives stepped in, everyone would stare at their phones. But there were certain groups of employees who always chatted comfortably with each other, while others seemed to make themselves as small as possible. One morning, he overheard a conversation that made his stomach turn. A group of workers was discussing the upcoming company party. "Don't bother trying to get on the planning committee," one person told another. "They always pick the same type of people. You know how it is." The thing was, he did know how it was, now. He'd seen it happening right in front of him for 2 weeks. The company had all these great programs for diversity and inclusion. They had training sessions, workshops, even awards. But watching from the reception desk, he could see how little difference these programs were actually making. Take the mentorship program, for example. On paper, it looked perfect. But he watched as certain employees got paired with powerful mentors who could actually help their careers, while others got stuck with mentors who never showed up for meetings. During lunch one day, he sat with some of the customer service team. They were talking about a recent round of promotions. "Did you notice?" One person said quietly. "Every single person who got promoted looks exactly like the people doing the promoting." The others just nodded, like this was something they'd seen too many times before. He started paying attention to the office layout too. Not just who sat where, but who felt comfortable walking into different areas. Some employees would take the long way around to avoid certain departments. Others would wait to use the break room until specific managers had left. The company's social media pages showed happy, diverse teams working together. But in reality, people stuck to their own groups. It wasn't official. Nobody said it out loud, but there were invisible lines everywhere. Who ate lunch with whom? Who got invited to after-work drinks? Who felt comfortable speaking up in meetings? One afternoon, while fixing the printer again, he listened to two employees talking about a team project. The quieter employee had come up with a brilliant solution to a problem. But in the meeting, her manager had interrupted her repeatedly, then later presented her idea as if it was his own. "I've stopped speaking up in meetings," she told her colleague. "What's the point? They either talk over me or take my ideas and pretend I thought of them." The CEO remembered all the diversity reports he proudly presented to the board. Reports showing how many people from different backgrounds they'd hired. But now he realized something important. Bringing people in was one thing. Making them feel like they truly belonged was something else entirely. He noticed how some employees had to work twice as hard just to be seen as equal. They had to be extra polite, extra prepared, extra everything. One person's casual suggestion would be dismissed, while another's would be praised as brilliant, even if they were saying the same thing. The most painful part was seeing how people had just accepted this as normal. They had developed their own survival strategies. Some stayed quiet and did their work. Others formed small support groups, warning each other about which managers to avoid or which meetings were really important. By the end of the week, his notebook was full of examples. But these weren't just random incidents anymore. They formed a clear pattern. A system that worked great for some people and created invisible barriers for others. Looking back at his original goals for this undercover mission, he realized he'd been asking the wrong questions. It wasn't just about why people were leaving the company. It was about how the company had created an environment where some people never really got a chance to succeed in the first place. As his time undercover was coming to an end, he knew one thing for sure. Fancy programs and policies weren't enough. The real changes needed to go much deeper. But first, he had to figure out how to fix a system that many people didn't even realize was broken. As the undercover mission continued, the weight of everything he'd seen started to really hit the CEO. Each night, he'd go home and sit in his study, thinking about how he'd completely missed what was happening in his own company. The fancy office on the top floor suddenly felt like it had been a bubble, keeping him from seeing the truth. One evening, his sister came over to check on him. She found him staring at all the company awards lined up on his shelf. "These don't mean anything anymore," he told her, picking up their latest diversity award. "We won this last year, you know. But now I realize we won it for just looking good on paper." He told her about a moment that had happened that day. A young employee had come up with an amazing idea for improving their customer service system. When she tried to present it in a meeting, her manager kept interrupting her. Later, that same manager pulled aside another employee, someone who looked more like him, and asked them to present the exact same idea tomorrow. The worst part is, the CEO said to his sister, "I'm starting to remember all the times people tried to tell me about these problems. But I was so convinced we were doing everything right. I had all these numbers and reports showing how diverse and inclusive we were. I thought that was enough." His sister listened as he described how strange it felt to be treated differently as a temp worker. People who used to smile and greet him now looked right through him. He watched other employees experience the same thing, but for them, it wasn't temporary. It was their everyday reality. "You know what really keeps me up at night?" he said, pacing around his study. "I'm a black CEO. I thought that automatically meant our company would be different. I thought my presence at the top would naturally make things better for everyone. But I've been just as blind as any other boss sitting in that top floor office." He pulled out his notebook, now almost full of observations and stories from his time undercover. "Look at this," he said, flipping through the pages. "Every day, there's another example of someone being shut out, talked over, or passed by. And these aren't just isolated incidents. It's like watching the same play being performed over and over, just with different actors. The CEO described how he'd watched talented people shrink themselves to fit in, how they changed their voices, their clothes, their hair, anything to avoid standing out. He remembered doing the same thing early in his career, but somehow he'd forgotten about that feeling after reaching the top. His sister noticed he barely touched his dinner. "When was the last time you actually ate properly?" she asked. He couldn't remember. His appetite had disappeared as he discovered more and more about what was really happening in his company. "You know what really got to me today?" he said, pushing away his plate. "I watched this group of employees planning an office celebration. They were so careful about making sure certain managers were invited, while other people, just as qualified, just as senior, weren't even considered, and nobody questioned it. It was just normal." He walked to his window, looking out at the city lights. "I keep thinking about all the people who've left our company over the years. How many of them left because they felt invisible? How many great ideas have we lost? How many potential leaders have we pushed away?" The CEO thought about his own journey to the top. Yes, he'd worked incredibly hard, but he'd also had mentors who believed in him, managers who gave him chances to prove himself. Now he was watching those same opportunities being quietly denied to others. "I built this company wanting to create something different," he told his sister. "Somewhere everyone would have a fair shot. But I've been fooling myself. Having good intentions isn't enough. Having nice-sounding policies isn't enough. We need to change things from the ground up." As his sister left that evening, she could see the determination in his eyes. He wasn't just sad or angry anymore. He was ready to act. The question was, how do you fix problems that half your company doesn't even realize exist? Sometimes it's not the big things that break you. It's that one small moment that makes everything crystal clear. For the undercover CEO, that moment came during his final days pretending to be a temp worker. He was sitting at the marketing department's reception desk when he overheard a meeting that changed everything. A young employee from the marketing team was presenting her project results to her department head. She'd been working on this campaign for months. The CEO knew this because he'd seen her staying late every night, perfecting every detail. The presentation was brilliant. She'd found a way to reach new customers that could save the company thousands of dollars. Her numbers were solid. Her research was perfect. But as she spoke, her manager kept cutting her off. "That's not really how we do things here," the manager said, barely looking up from his phone. "And you're coming across a bit aggressive." The CEO felt his hands tighten on his desk. He knew that word, aggressive. He'd heard it too many times in his own career. It was one of those words that somehow only got used for certain people, especially when they were being confident and capable. The young employee tried to continue, her voice getting quieter with each interruption. "The data shows this could increase our customer base by 30%. I think you're not understanding our company culture," her manager cut in again. "Maybe if you were a better team player." Through the glass walls, the CEO could see other team members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked down at their notebooks. Others pretended to be very interested in their coffee cups. Nobody spoke up. Later that day, he watched as the same manager presented a suspiciously similar marketing plan to the senior executives. But now it was his innovative approach and his creative solution. The young employee's name wasn't mentioned once. During lunch break, he found her sitting alone in the stairwell, trying not to cry. She didn't know he was really the CEO. To her, he was just Rob the temp, someone else at the bottom of the company ladder. "I worked so hard," she told him, wiping her eyes. "I double-checked everything. I practiced that presentation for weeks. But it didn't matter. Nothing I do ever matters here." She showed him a folder on her phone. Dozens of other ideas she'd developed, research she'd done, suggestions she'd made. All of them had been dismissed or taken by others. "I'm thinking of quitting," she said. "I just can't do this anymore." The CEO felt something break inside him. He thought about all the talent the company had probably lost this way. How many others had sat in stairwells, crying over stolen ideas and broken dreams? How many had given up and left, taking their brilliance elsewhere? That afternoon, he watched The Office with new eyes. He saw how some people walked around with confidence, never doubting their place, while others made themselves small, trying to avoid attention. He noticed how the same behavior that got some people labeled confident got others called difficult. In a team meeting later that day, he counted how many times certain people were interrupted compared to others. The pattern was so clear it felt like a slap in the face. How had he never noticed this before? The final straw came when he overheard two managers discussing upcoming promotions. "She's good," one said, "but is she really ready for leadership? She can be a bit, you know." The other manager nodded, understanding perfectly what wasn't being said. They moved on to discuss another candidate, someone with less experience, but who felt like a better fit. Sitting at his temporary desk, pretending to sort mail, the CEO made his decision. He couldn't watch this happen anymore. His 3 weeks of being undercover were supposed to end in 2 days, but he'd seen enough. It was time to reveal who he really was. But more importantly, it was time to reveal what his company had really become. Not the perfect workplace shown in their ads and reports, but a place where talent was being wasted and dreams were being crushed. All because of unspoken rules about who got to succeed and who didn't. That night, he started planning how he would tell everyone the truth. Not just about his undercover mission, but about everything he'd seen and learned. It would be the hardest thing he'd ever done as CEO. But then again, sometimes the hardest things are exactly what need to be done. The morning of the company-wide meeting felt different. Nobody knew what was coming, but everyone could sense something big was about to happen. The email had gone out the night before. Mandatory all-staff meeting, 10 a.m., main conference room. The CEO arrived early, still dressed as Rob the temp worker. He watched from his reception desk as people filed in. The cleaning staff huddled near the back walls. Middle managers grouped together in the middle rows. Senior executives took their usual spots up front. Everyone staying in their invisible but very real assigned places. At exactly 10 a.m., the HR director stood up to start the meeting. "Before we begin," she said, "our CEO has an important announcement." The room buzzed with whispers. The CEO wasn't there, or at least, that's what everyone thought. Some people checked their phones, probably wondering if he was running late. That's when he stood up from the reception desk. He watched as confusion spread across the room. A few people recognized him despite the makeup and different clothes. Others just looked puzzled, wondering why a temp worker was walking to the front of the room. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying the authority that he'd hidden for 3 weeks. "Some of you know me as the CEO. But for the past 3 weeks, I've been working among you as Rob, the temp receptionist." The room went completely silent. He could see the shock on people's faces as they started to recognize him. Some people looked scared, others angry, and a few seemed almost relieved. "I've spent these weeks watching how our company really works," he continued. "Not how it looks on paper, not how it appears in our reports, but how it actually functions day to day." He pulled out his notebook and started sharing specific examples. He talked about the cleaning staff being banned from the main break room, though no such policy existed. He described watching good ideas being stolen from some employees and credited to others. He talked about the pattern of interruptions in meetings, about who got promoted and who got ignored. "I saw how some of us can speak up without fear, while others have to carefully choose every word," he said. "I watched talented people being labeled as difficult just for doing the same things that got others labeled as leadership material." Some managers started shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Others stared at the floor. But many employees, especially those in the back of the room, sat up straighter, finally feeling seen. He described the young employee whose marketing plan had been stolen just days ago. She's not the only one, he said. How many great ideas have we lost because we weren't willing to hear them from certain people? How many talented workers have we pushed away? Then he did something unexpected. He started talking about his own failure as a leader. I thought having a black CEO automatically meant we were doing things right, he admitted. I was wrong. I let myself believe that good intentions and nice-looking policies were enough. I failed to see what was really happening in the company I built. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. But now I've seen it, he continued. I've seen it through your eyes. And starting today, things are going to change. He turned to face the executives in the front row. And if anyone has a problem with these changes, they're welcome to find another company to work for. That's when he noticed something. People in the back of the room had started to stand up. Then others joined them. Soon, most of the room was standing. Not applauding, not cheering. Just standing together, showing that they were ready for change. I'm not going to pretend this will be easy, he said, looking around the room. Change never is. But I promised you this. What I've seen these past 3 weeks will never happen in this company again. As he finished speaking, he could feel the energy in the room shift. For some, it was hope. For others, fear. But everyone knew that nothing would be the same after today. The facade had cracked, the truth was out, and now the real work could begin. 6 months can change everything if you're doing the right things. After that dramatic company meeting, the CEO knew that promises weren't enough. People needed to see real action. The first changes happened immediately. The very next day, workers came in to find all break rooms open to everyone. The old basement break room was completely renovated to be just as nice as the others. But that was just the beginning. The CEO created a special team to lead the changes. But here's what made it different. It wasn't just executives making decisions. The team included people from every level of the company. A member of the cleaning staff, a receptionist, junior employees, middle managers, and senior leaders all working together. We need to hear from everyone, the CEO told them in their first meeting. Because everyone sees problems and solutions that others might miss. One of the biggest changes came in how ideas were handled. Every presentation now had to show exactly who worked on the project. No more managers taking credit for their team's work. When the young employee whose marketing plan had been stolen presented her ideas again, this time directly to the CEO. Her strategy ended up saving the company over $200,000 in its first month. They changed how promotions worked, too. Instead of managers just picking their favorites, every position had clear requirements. People from different departments would review each candidate, making it harder for bias to creep in. But the most powerful change was in the day-to-day stuff. The CEO made sure managers were trained to recognize their own biases. They learned about how words like aggressive or not a good fit were often used unfairly against certain people. More importantly, they learned to stop doing it. The company started something called reverse mentoring. Senior leaders were paired with junior employees from different backgrounds. The leaders weren't there to teach. They were there to learn. They heard firsthand about experiences different from their own, about challenges they'd never faced. Some of these changes weren't easy. A few managers quit, uncomfortable with the new way of doing things. But for every person who left because things were too different, 3 new talented people joined, excited to work at a company that was really trying to change. The CEO kept his old habit from his undercover days, walking around different departments, sitting in different break rooms, actually listening to people. But now he did it as himself, no disguise needed. One day, about 4 months after the big reveal, he overheard something that made him smile. 2 employees were talking in the break room, the same break room that used to be off limits to some staff. One was a senior manager, the other a member of the cleaning team. They were excitedly discussing an idea to make the building's recycling system better. You should present that at the next town hall, the manager said. It's a great idea, and you know the building better than anyone. Little moments like this started happening more and more. People who used to stay quiet in meetings began speaking up. Ideas started coming from everywhere, not just the usual places. The company started growing faster than ever, but this time, everyone was growing together. The numbers told the story too. Employee turnover dropped by 60%. Satisfaction scores went up across all departments. The company started winning awards again, but this time, they were awards they actually deserved. But the CEO's favorite change was something you couldn't measure. It was in how people moved through the building now. No more taking the long way around, no more avoiding certain areas. No more hiding who they were or making themselves smaller. One afternoon, his sister visited the office. She stood with him, watching people interact in the main lobby. "It feels different in here," she said. "It is different," he replied. "We're not perfect yet. We still have work to do. But now, we're actually doing the work, not just talking about it." As they walked through the building, employees greeted them, not with fear or fake smiles, but with genuine warmth. The invisible walls were coming down. The unwritten rules were being rewritten. The CEO thought back to his time as Rob the Temp. The problems he'd seen then hadn't disappeared completely. Change doesn't happen overnight. But now they were being faced honestly, dealt with openly, and solved together. Sometimes the hardest thing a leader can do is admit they were wrong. But sometimes that's also the thing that leads to the biggest changes. The company wasn't just different now. It was better. And this time, it was better for everyone.